Hey, everybody, this is Addison Berry, and you're listening to the Osio Labs podcast, the show that explores the question, how do we create sustainable businesses that care for people and make the world a better place? On today's episode, I'm joined by Sarah Maurer, certified breathworker, hypnotist, and integrative life coach. This is episode number 5 about long COVID and how that affects people's lives, especially when it comes to work. What is it? What does it do? What do businesses need to be aware of to help their long COVID employees? That's why we have Sarah on this call. So thanks for joining.
Thanks,
You are
Addie.
certainly an expert. Why don't you just give a little bit of context for why you are an expert on this, or why I chose you for this call?
Absolutely. Thanks, Addie. Yeah, so I am a person that has been, I hate to say recovered, I like the word recovering a little bit better from long COVID for about 10 months. I've come a long way, and I also really understand like what it's like to walk this path, how it can impact your work life, like all areas of your life, work life, social life, finances, self-concept, general enjoyment of life.
Mm,
And it's been interesting for me because I'm also a helping professional. I was a
mhm.
counselor for many years and currently working as a life coach, certified as a hypnotist. And I think one of the most interesting aspects, also certified as a breath worker. So, really interested in the autonomic nervous
Mhm.
system, things like emotional management and regulation. So, it's been so fascinating to be able to study how the long COVID impacts that, like inside myself. So,
Right.
I'm sure we'll talk about more about that.
Right. You've got like real like evidence right here, right in front of you. Like
It's
right in
so
you.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so interesting because, yeah, there's so little, as we'll talk about, research about this. Like, it's very poorly understood. So I kind of feel like I am like on the forefront of research as a person that has
Mhm.
it, like kind of experimenting. And I bet a lot of people with it feel that way.
Yeah. Okay, well let's dig into this. And just for starters, let's define what long COVID is, because I think everybody hears this term. Some people are just overhearing it because it's, COVID's so we're done. And if it's not affecting our lives, it's just like a thing and I don't care or I don't know or whatever. So let's just define what is long COVID.
Sure. And I'm just going to speak from the patient's point of view. I'm not a doctor
Mhm.
or a researcher, an epidemiologist, obviously, but and part of the problem is that there is so little definition of what it actually is.
Right.
As you'll see, as soon as I start like talking about what we think it might be, it's hard to be taken seriously as someone who
Mm.
has this condition. So many people, like I literally went out to dinner with a friend I hadn't seen for a while last night, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I've been dealing with long COVID," and she's like, "Well, how do you know you have that?" And I'm like,
Ugh.
"Oh, wrong question, right?"
Right.
But yeah, but I mean, in some ways, like my answer to her was, I don't know, because there really is no diagnostic criteria.
Mhm.
Basically, kind of the layman's definition, it's persistent COVID symptoms or new symptoms that appear beyond 4 weeks after first having an infection. Over 200 symptoms have been described, attributed to this condition. I know, right? So some of the common ones: fatigue, autonomic dysfunction, brain fog, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which just means like when you go from sitting to standing or lying to standing, your body just goes haywire, you're dizzy,
Ugh.
your heart is racing. People have neuropsychiatric symptoms, anxiety, depression, other mental illness. A lot of people are exercise intolerant. That's been like the hardest symptom for me. I used to be an
Mm.
ultra runner, and I
Ugh.
am about to run like a half marathon after 10 months, which is so exciting. But it's been a long time, like getting back. I wasn't able to exercise at all for a long time, which was such a mental health thing. But
Mm.
anyway, yeah, common symptoms: headaches, sleep disturbances, gut issues. Yeah, and there's the lack of clear definition, as I'm sure we'll talk about, makes it really hard to be taken seriously. It makes it hard to get diagnosed in the medical community, and it makes it hard, especially if you're very affected, to get accommodations, disability
Mhm.
benefits at work.
Oh, yeah.
So, and it's such a huge impact because Yeah, 22% of people with this condition, according to some studies, cannot work at all. About half, at some point at least, reduce their workload. And we're talking probably 10 to 30% of people who have had COVID have some long COVID symptoms. So it's a huge thing for work and companies and economic impacts.
Wow. Yeah, that list of symptoms is so, and this relates and sort of takes me, I guess, into my next question, which is how does this relate to like other chronic illnesses? Because there are a lot of chronic illnesses out there that are long-term things, and there are lots of them that are somewhat ill-defined.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm curious, like we're talking specifically about long COVID here, but I guess like how much of this conversation do you think would apply broadly to ill-defined chronic illness?
Like hugely.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a very literal way, on one level, like a lot of people with long COVID meet the diagnostic criteria for other chronic illnesses, things
Mm,
like, I always say this wrong, like myalgic encephalopathy, which is chronic fatigue syndrome, kind of the new
okay.
name for it.
Gotcha.
Another one a lot of people meet the diagnosis for is, oh gosh, mast cell activation syndrome, which is when your body can't process histamine. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank
Uh,
goodness I got that. I've been like thinking about how I'm going to say that all day because I always forget. Yeah, and yes, like even if and things like depression, anxiety, obviously, but it really is true that basically we're just dealing with someone who maybe looks well. Their illness may be invisible, but they
mhm.
still feel sick every day. They still live with this every day. They still do not feel well every day. And I think that, especially for me, I even think back to friends that were maybe dealing with chronic illness symptoms before I had a chronic illness. It's so hard to really appreciate what that's like, how that feels, how that affects you, how you feel so unacknowledged
Mhm.
because it is hard for other people to see. And even if they can see it, unless they've gone through something similar, it's so hard to understand. So I would say 100%, almost everything we're going to talk about today, if you are someone that is dealing with a mysterious illness or undiagnosed illness, undiagnosed like complex of symptoms, it's all true. It's all,
Mhm.
all of it applies. I really think so. There's a
Mhm.
really great quote about how to have a mysterious illness is to be systematically unwitnessed
Yeah.
that I've heard in the long COVID context. But yeah, it was from someone that had chronic fatigue syndrome, I believe.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
interesting because I haven't actually looked into this too much, but I just learned this past weekend that here in Denmark there's a program where they have like lanyards or like bands that people can wear that are green and have like flowers on them. And it's mostly especially used for children, but it's to signify that you have an invisible disability
Oh my
so that
gosh.
people have some visual clue that you might not be operating at what other people would perceive as 100%, and to be aware of it. So and that like just talking about that visibility thing
Yeah.
and that witnessing, right? It's just like just because people on the outside look a certain way or even behave and act in a certain way and you just have these assumptions about them, it's like you don't know what they're
Yeah.
dealing with and what's going on and how hard that is. And then on top of it being ignored, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, my heart just like really connects to that. I think my inner child wants to wear the armband.
Yes, totally, totally. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how much you want to dig into how much long COVID has affected you personally, just as sort of an example, because
Sure.
there's this huge range of symptoms.
Mhm.
There's like all of these different ways that it impacts people's lives. And so but again, only as much as you want to actually share, like how
Sure.
has it impacted you? And I guess like what has been frustrating for you? I mean, I already hear like just not being seen for where you are is massive, but are there other frustrations, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll just speak from my experience and just keeping in mind, like, this is a disease that shows up like so many different ways. So,
Hmm.
my experience is typical in some ways and very atypical in other ways. I'm really lucky that I'm kind of on the milder end. I've never really, other than, I think even in my acute COVID illness, I pretty much worked right through it. Yeah, because like,
Mm,
yeah, my symptoms were often as they are with this condition. The initial symptoms were not severe.
gotcha.
Yeah, it was a pretty mild illness. And then, yeah, like a few months later is when it got really hard. I'm very lucky also in the sense that I have two jobs and they're both very flexible. In addition to my practice where I'm working with people as a helping professional change worker, I'm also working. I still have my half-time corporate job that I've had for a
Hmm.
long time. So I'm working in marketing and I am on a flex schedule, which is incredibly nice. Like I
Wow.
have a
Yeah.
pretty understanding and laid back boss who has been amazing. But yeah, like one thing I noticed and like through most of my illness as I was working is my productive hours per day were much less. And
Hmm.
I usually could count like before on having like 10 hours a day to like get all the household chores done, get all my
Hmm.
work done at both jobs, get, socializing done, like kind of like like all the parts of life done. And I'd say like during like the worst part of my illness, I was probably at about 5, and that was like really hard to swallow.
Yeah.
And then for a while, I was probably about 7 for that was probably the longest phase. And I'm just like in the past like month or two, pretty close to back to 10. So it really has forced me. And I think this is such a good lesson for individuals, for businesses to just get very lean and focus on what's really important, like things that
Hmm.
used to feel very urgent, like cleaning my house or like looking really nice before I went out, or even like hanging out with certain people, which sounds terrible. It's really like forced me to go into my heart and be like, what? What are the
Mm.
most important things? Because I only have time for those, which has been, in a way, like kind of an amazing and life changing and growing thing that I hope I continue as I feel better. And it's also changed the nature and direction of my work as a change worker, hypnotist, coach in a really good way. I feel
Mm.
like I'm really like trusting myself rather than, oh my gosh, I have to go into a session very prepared and think about it a lot ahead of time, which I don't have time to do. So it's really been like, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, I have to go in, I have to let it flow, I have to really
Hmm.
listen to what the client is telling me and follow their lead, which has been amazing. Like, I think it's made me such a better coach. I kind of, the joke is that I kind of wing a lot of stuff, but it really has, like, in a lot of ways, been a blessing. And I actually ended up getting certified in a kind of a modality that was a lot more client centered, that it was like allowing
Hmm.
us to both flow and just kind of take the session where it went. So that's been really kind of some of the good things.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's two things I want to point out from that. One is because it's interesting when you were just like, that my number of productive hours, like my mind is just going to like, all right, like work hours. But like productive hours is like your whole life. You're trying to do things, right? And so like when looking at someone's box of energy, right?
Mhm.
It's not just work. That's not the only thing that is taking someone's energy. And I feel like from a business perspective, people tend to only think of the box of when you come into the office and leave the office.
Yeah.
And and it's just like there's a lot of other things. I mean, regardless of illness, there's just a lot of life that takes up a lot of productive energy and time. And yeah, if you've already spent 6 hours of your day just trying to live, how much time do you think you have left for for
Seriously.
work? And then that brings you to that prioritization thing, right? You are prioritizing all of the things that need to happen in a given day or a given week. And, work is one of those things. It's not the only thing being prioritized. But then within that work bucket, being really aware of what is the priority there, because maybe not all of those things can be prioritized either. And this is just generally true.
Yeah.
It's especially true with illness, but it's
Yeah.
also just generally true. Like people
Yeah.
just only have so much that they can be doing, and it changes. It flows, it moves. It's not like everybody has the exact same set hours of productive energy within them every single day that they wake up. Like that's just not
Mhm.
realistic. So
That's
anyway, that
awesome, Addie.
I think that's
Yeah.
like a very good point for people to just sort of contemplate, like sit back and think about when you're trying to put context to all of this. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention quickly is an aside, which is that Sarah is my coach, so I can validate that her coaching
Best
method
client ever.
is working really, really well. Because we've had
Addie
some,
has seen the whole evolution too. Like you've been with me while I was going from kind of a more cognitive coach to a hypnotist. So I don't know how that's been for you, but
yeah, no, but it's been great because I do feel like things really, like we've been able to go into some really interesting places and some really interesting conversations.
yeah,
Um,
fun.
and it's been hugely helpful to me. So anyway, that's just an aside, but that positive change that has sort of been pushed because of this happening, right? That it is having a beneficial impact, at least for me personally. So I'll just
Yeah.
put that
Oh, I'm so
out
happy
there.
to hear that. It really is like a kind of a microcosm of life, like held up for one. It's interesting when you have a chronic illness. I'm like, yeah, that energy box is very visible.
Right. Right. It's got very distinct edges.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit just sort of about like how it's impacted you at work. You've been in a really good situation. And then I guess like carrying on from that context of a work day for a person is a limited box of priorities that are possible and stuff like that. And so of course like, businesses and managers and all this can be aware of these things, but like what and it like there are so many symptoms like you said, and it impacts people in so many different ways,
Mhm.
but are there any general, I'm a business owner or I'm a manager and I want to be
Yeah.
better at this, I want to even understand this better, like what do I do, how do I make it more better?
Yeah, such a good question. I think one of the most important things, and maybe the first thing, a great place to start, is we really just need to think about how there's kind of an idea out there that people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses can't work or they can't
Mm-hmm.
work as much. And I shared some statistics at the beginning. A lot of them are not working as much or working at all. But some of that may have to do with environments at work being rigid and just not being really built for them. So I think we really have to, as a society, because this is just going to impact us so much for
Mm-hmm. This
years,
is not going
most
away.
likely. Yeah, this is not, yeah, even though the COVID emergency is over in some places, it's going to be with us for a long time. We really need to think about, yeah, like how can we create environments where everyone can work and where people with like diverse energy levels can be in a place where they're able to contribute what they can contribute. So I recommend for anyone who's really interested in this. I heard an excellent podcast. I think I dropped it in our show notes,
Mm-hmm.
Addie. There's a company called Visible, and the creator is a man with long COVID who was very frustrated, as many of us are, that there's really
Mm-hmm.
nothing, no devices, no like metrics, nothing quantifiable to help us like kind of monitor our energy levels so that we can be more predictive about how much we should be doing, when we should be doing
Mm-hmm.
things, when we should be resting. So he actually created a company that's creating a wearable. It has a free app called Visible that you can download and use. It has a lot of pacing tools to help you manage energy levels. But the interesting thing about this company, it's a startup, and like half of their workers are actually people with long COVID. So he talks in
Mm-hmm.
that podcast about a little bit about their company and their company culture and how the schedules are incredibly flexible. People are all on flex time. They can work in the middle of the night if they want. Some of the things they use to really accommodate that, they use asynchronous communication. So there are
Yep.
really no meetings. There's just things like maybe Slack or Teams, or I'm not sure exactly what they use, but just different channels so that people can communicate their work when they're ready to communicate. And then whenever the person that's ready to receive is ready to receive it, they can go in there and pick it up. And they've actually been able to move this along like so fast with a company culture that is completely set up for just people that may be working at odd times and may not be able to come to, they have no meetings, which I thought was amazing. And not
Yeah.
saying that meetings are always bad, but maybe really thinking about how that affects people. That if you're having like a meeting every Monday at 8 o'clock just to all touch base, how does that affect the person that has a chronic illness that may have difficulty sleeping and just may
Mm-hmm.
feel terrible and not very alert in the morning or not be able to get up at all? So yeah, some ideas there. I really like encourage companies, managers, especially if you're in a position, to think about benefits, creative ways to help
Mm-hmm.
employees. This is an expensive disease. Like, I am not even very affected, but a lot of this is a whole other conversation we could probably have.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of my treatment right now, the treatment that is actually working is happening kind of outside the traditional medical system. I actually go
Right.
to a doctor online who's in a different state than me. All she does is long COVID, and she has a concierge practice. So I pay her out of pocket. And then things she prescribes to me are not covered by my insurance. And
Ugh.
I mean, they're not like crazy expensive, but it can get expensive depending on what
Mm-hmm.
kind of treatments you want to try as a person with long COVID, with chronic illness. So, yeah, just thinking about if there are financially creative ways that you can support your employees, whether that's a grant, a fund, a stipend, something just to help out with it. And just also knowing that they may be financially stressed at this time. Yeah. And then I think the other two things just really are kind of cultural things. Long COVID patients are, like we said, are very invisible. They're very talked over. I get a lot of people asking me, how do you know you have this? I actually never tested positive for COVID, even though I was exposed to it pretty obviously. But for whatever reason, my test, the home test, never came up positive. And then a doctor actually said to me, like, you really should go and try to get the PCR and come up positive, because if you have long COVID later, it's going to like make it
Ah.
easier to be taken seriously by medicine, by work. I
Ah.
went in 12 days later, I got the PCR, and of course it's negative. But about 15% of people that present having this condition never actually tested positive. That's pretty common.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think just as a culture, just like being aware of that, being aware even people who did test positive have a hard time being taken seriously. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the way you do that is to really treat that person as the expert in their own condition. This is true of all chronic illnesses. I think
Right.
it's so true. So instead of being like, how do you know you have that? Or are you
Mm-hmm.
sure? Or, like, or giving like advice, things
Or
you
I
heard
heard
off
about
the
this other
internet.
person who had it, and you don't sound
Right.
anything like that.
I know you don't have like, you're not tired all
Ah.
the time like Susie.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Yeah, treat them like the expert. Ask questions. They generally, I found in this community, like, we all have to take responsibility for educating ourselves because there's not a lot out there. So they might be able to tell you quite a bit. And
Yeah.
then just focus on making the invisible visible. Like, as a company, do you have like a community, a place, a safe space for people with chronic illness? Chronic illness is kind of a nice word that, like we said,
Mhm.
that includes like the big umbrella of people that maybe are dealing with something that is limiting their function, limiting their energy, but they're not exactly sure what it is. They're undiagnosed. So, yeah, just creating safe spaces for that, talking about it as a company. We talked about there's a lot of people with long COVID. There's probably two in the United States alone, where I live, there's probably 2 to 3 million people with chronic fatigue syndrome. It's hugely underdiagnosed. Most of them are not diagnosed, but they know
Mhm.
that they're tired. They know that they're having a hard time. And if you think about the whole world, how many people that is. So, yeah, those are some of my thoughts, Addie. Like, I'm
Awesome.
curious to hear yours.
Yeah, well, the thing is like when I'm listening to this and I'm like, yes, yes, these things all make sense. This is how businesses should operate anyway. Like it shouldn't just be for chronic illness, right? Because it makes me think of just when reading or talking and listening to people who are disabled in any way. And they're like, when we make changes to accommodate people, regardless of the reason for their quote unquote disability or their illness or whatever, it works for everybody. right? Like
Yes.
we are making a more accommodating, a more sustainable, life-worthy environment for everyone when we accommodate. But what often happens is people are like, oh, you need a special accommodation. Okay, well, let's see what we can
Yes. Amen,
do.
sister. Sorry.
Right.
I'm just feeling this very strongly.
Yeah, and so it's like it's super frustrating to me when you get that pushback for special accommodations, and I'm just like, what? But human being, like, this is what we should be thinking about and trying to do all the time. And so anything that a company would do that could help accommodate people specifically with chronic illnesses or long COVID is going to benefit all of the employees, the entire company. And as you were saying, like, you have these people with chronic illnesses who are not working or not working full time. And that is for sure valid from like their condition, that just not going to happen. But there's also a percentage and an element of that is
Mhm.
simply they cannot perform and work within the conditions that they are expected to. And
Yes.
that's a really different level of not productive.
And I think that's a big group, actually. It's a
Mm-hmm.
large percentage of people with disabilities, chronic conditions.
Totally. So if we would just be aware of these things, lean into these and figure this out, like you would end up with, I mean, if you want to look at it from like, big old capitalist corporate mindset, we would end up with a more productive society, right? But like you would also just end up with happier, healthier people. Like
Right?
just
Let's accommodate the humanness.
yeah. So, right, I think there's like this
I love it.
this idea of like, what can I do for people with chronic illness? It's like, I don't know, treat
Yes,
them like a human being.
yes.
Like, let's let's start there, work our way out. But I'm also really glad like that you brought up things
Mhm.
that I think a lot of people don't think of or don't want to talk about, like financial stress. And like, oh, that's
Yeah.
something for insurance to figure out or for their families to figure out. Like that's not a thing
Yeah.
that I as a manager should think about or be aware of, that they might be financially stressed right now. But
Yeah.
I mean, again, this is this whole big picture. And again, speaking of like, chronic illness, people's productivity and making accommodation. I mean, there's, you know, disabilities, there's illnesses, but there are things like grief. It can be
Yeah. Oh,
crippling. Like people
that
have
is hard.
so many
Yeah.
things happening in their lives.
Yeah.
And so I just, like all of these things, all of this affects everybody at some point in their life, which is why this is something we need to just generally address as
Yeah.
companies instead of trying to frame it as a special case. And
Right.
do I need to justify this special case or not? It's like, well,
Right.
all humans at some point probably experience something that diminishes their quote unquote productivity for
It's
the
true.
machine. So, how about we think about that from a broader picture, a broader perspective? So that's what I sort of take away from all of this is
I'm
like,
like,
let's do it.
amen. It's so interesting as you're speaking, and if this is a tangent, feel free to edit it out. But one thing that comes up to me as I'm hearing you talk about like humans and let's accommodate the humanness and the individual differences and the individual experiences that just kind of move through us as we're just walking this path of being human. And I think of women, like women
Hmm.
are cycle, like are,
Oh
even if we
yeah.
don't actually have a period, like every day literally is a different internal environment for us. Whereas men, like the way I've always heard it explained, men have a cycle, but it all happens in 24 hours, whereas ours happens in
Ah,
28 days. And like a lot of work environments are really like kind of set up to every day is the same. Because for men that set it up, it was, but for
yeah.
women that maybe have a couple days a month where they're just very like maybe at
Mm-hmm.
work just struggling
Totally.
so hard to pay attention and they're in pain and they're brain fogged and they're just not productive. Like some countries are actually starting to give leave for
Yep.
for like women whenever you're at that point in your cycle. And I just love that. So I don't know. That just reminded me as you were
Totally,
talking.
totally related. And actually, this is a bigger tangent, and we're not going to go there now. But on a future podcast, and
Future
you and I have
podcast.
also talked about this, the whole just like cycles of being a human being. Like there's so many cycles. There's seasonal cycles, there's physical cycles, there's, family life change cycles. There's so much happening, and we have 5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. It's the same all the time, and we expect this factory machine existence in a world that doesn't look anything like that. So
Right?
I have a whole podcast episode
Oh
coming
my
up on
gosh.
that
I can't
one.
wait to hear it, Addie. Please make that one. Yeah, I always tell people like we are nature and nature is cycles. The tides go in and out
Mhm.
and we are the
Yeah,
same.
it's all moving all the time for
Right.
sure. Well, we should probably wrap this one up because you and I, we can just keep jawing
I
on for
know.
hours. But thank you so much for coming and talking about this. This is huge, and I think this is such a great topic because I think people really need to just be aware. Like this is real and
Yeah.
how it really affects people, and it's not going away anytime
Mm-mm.
soon. And so, like, let's talk about it instead of pretending it doesn't exist. So thank you.
Thank you for talking about it. Like I think this is a beautiful like step in that direction to have it on your podcast.
Cool. Well, I'll be talking to you in the future. So we can say goodbye
You
for
take it
now
away,
for the
Addie.
podcast.
Yes, I will see you soon.
Hey, so thanks for listening, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for what you'd like to hear more about. You can find all of the various ways to reach us on our website at osiolabs.com. That's OSIOLABS.com. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your podcast provider of choice. We'll catch you on the next episode.